Closing cost credits, that's a very familiar question. I'm always explaining that to sellers when we sit down. I'm working with buyers on it. From the buyer perspective, let's start there. The buyer may want to make a purchase but have a limited amount of dollars available for a down payment and also for closing costs available. And that's just part of the necessary evil of purchasing real estate, is that it's going to cost some money and someone has to pay for that along the way. In that same example that we just discussed before, say the $200,000 sale, if a buyer works with an FHA purchase, they're going to typically need about 3.5% down, and that's about $7,000 for the down payment. In addition to that, they're going to have an expense of closing costs, which could be total dollars somewhere in the neighborhood of $5,000 to say $7,000 on it, or around 3% of the purchase price. So let's say that buyer then on that $200,000 purchase has great credit or good credit, at least enough to be able to get them over whatever the threshold is. And then they're in a position where they have that down payment, they have the $7,000, $8,000 in the bank, but and the ability to buy because their jobs are solid jobs. However, at that point, they're still short because they don't have the extra $6,000 or $7,000 for the closing costs. Or they might need that money or want to hold on to that money to do some renovations of the property once they get inside. And what's the way that we overcome that? The way that we overcome that is that if we're representing the purchaser, then we go to that seller eventually when we prepare an offer on behalf of the purchaser, and we ask that seller, hey, can we get a closing cost credit in the amount of X amount of dollars? And again, the typical threshold of around 3%, we ask the seller to contribute $6,000 at the time of closing, and then that, in essence, covers the buyer for their closing costs. So two options. Buyer has $7,000 under that scenario and gets $6,000 back from the seller at closing, or the buyer has $13,000 or $14,000 that they need to close the deal. On an economic basis, purely looking at it, there's a lot more individuals that are out there that have $7,000 than have $14,000, and therefore that's why the closing cost credit has become a very popular tool to get first-time buyers, especially into properties along the way. Now, one of the pitfalls to watch out for, though, in the closing cost credit is to remember that the property must appraise out at the top number. So whatever the negotiated price is on it, so let's say it's that $200,000 example, and let's say that the client offers the $200,000 and asks for a 3% credit. So the net dollars in that transaction then turn out to be $194,000 net dollars to the seller. So that's their real money that they're getting because, again, they're subsidizing that purchase by adding in or giving at the time of the closing to the buyer that $6,000. So ultimately, the seller's real number on a $200,000 offer is $194,000, and if that's an acceptable offer to the seller, then they move forward with the individual transaction. The property, however, must appraise at that top number again. So if the property is artificially boosted in price to cover the closing cost credit, that may be a trip hazard that you would encounter 3 or 4 weeks into the transaction when it actually becomes time for that financing portion of the deal to be completed.